We are here for trial day 1 of Florida versus Sarah Boone. They will be starting with opening statements at some point today. She is accused and charged with second-degree murder for the killing of her boyfriend, Jorge Torres. The defense is saying that it was a mistake and or it was in self-defense, and the prosecution is saying absolutely not. She knew that he was in a life-threatening situation. She doubled down and then she left him zipped into a suitcase. And what we heard more about yesterday is that the prosecution has also said that she not only said that she hit him multiple times with a baseball bat, but that his injuries and his autopsy also confirm that he was hit while he was in the suitcase with a baseball bat, which is going to make it very hard for her to run the self-defense that she is hoping to run. There is a 6-person deliberating jury, but this judge has lots of alternates because stuff happens. It's busy. Trials are busy. These defense attorneys have only been with this case for about 45 days. However, they chose to take this case after Sarah Boone was deemed to represent herself. And when they chose to take this case, they knew the trial date was set. So the judge does not have a lot of empathy. The defense attorneys, though new to this case, are deemed to have known everything that has been known from all the past 8 attorneys and Sarah Boone herself over the past 4 years. We are at the lunch break of day 1 of the Sarah Boone trial in Florida, and we have gotten through opening statements and 5 witnesses from the state. Yes, 5 witnesses and opening statements before the lunch break. And that's with the court starting almost an hour and a half late because they were still arguing motions. Once the motions got done, this trial has moved along swiftly. The prosecutor's questioning has been direct and to the point. So far, the witnesses have been direct and to the point. The cross-examination has also been direct and to the point. So as we are now, this trial has been moving right along. The jury has been qualified for 3 weeks. I don't think they will need it. And what we heard in opening statements from the defense after the microphones in the courtroom were all turned on, we heard them say they think that the jury will hear from Sarah Boone next week. It is Friday, October 18th. That means sometime next week, we will be hearing from Sarah Boone on the stand. We will see how that goes as we get into early next week. And I cannot wait to see what is going to happen. But as for opening statements, it was rocky for the prosecution in that it was very hard for us to hear because as the prosecutor was away from the podium, the microphones in the courtroom were not picking up the prosecutor's opening statement well, and that was difficult for the audience at home. For the jury, I think it was fine. Opening statements, we did get the prosecution's recitation of the video that is central to their case, where the victim, Jorge Torres, is inside the suitcase and Sarah Boone is mocking him as he is saying that he can't breathe. So the prosecutor went through, like he did yesterday in motions, just the transcript from that. He went through transcripts of some text messages back and forth with presumably Sarah Boone and one of George's brothers, where she is seemingly rambling on in text. And then the brother says, Sarah, get that help that you need. God bless you. And she talks about making Jorge disappear and things will be, all caps, better. The prosecution also talks about the fact that she chose to leave him in the suitcase, that he could not get out, that the suitcase was zipper side down, the top of the suitcase was down, and he couldn't get out of the suitcase. Then it got a little lost in analogies as he was away from the microphone talking about mutual violence in the relationship, talking about violence from the victim towards Sarah Boone, but also talking about the fact that Sarah told law enforcement that on this day, everything was great. They had a lovely evening. They drank some wine, they painted, they did puzzles together, and they were messing around and playing hide and seek. Now, as we get into the witnesses, there's a little more information there. The defense said, buried in the middle of their opening statement, that Sarah Boone, quote, loved the man, but not the abuse. And I think that's what they should have led with in their opening statement. And it should have been the theme of their opening statement that Sarah Boone was in this relationship because she loved George Torres, but she did not love the abuse, because that plays into the defense that they are going to be bringing. Where things got a little lost for the defense in opening statement is when they were talking about the fact that this was an accident, that it was not intentional. They said Sarah Boone lied to the police because the police were trying to make this seem in her 2-hour interrogation like it was an intentional crime, and it wasn't intentional. And so she lied to the police. But then he said that it was self-defense, that though it was unconventional, he called the suitcase a unconventional method of restraint, and she was restraining George Torres from attacking her. Well, then that is intentional, not accidental. So there were times that the defense seemed to be arguing two conflicting theories of the case, between the self-defense and between the she didn't have any intent to do this and she thought he could get out and that would be fine. If she thought that he could get out, then how is she restraining him so she's protected? I found parts of that opening statement to be internally conflicting. And if that doesn't straighten out, it's going to be tough, because the defense needs a very clear message to the jury, and hedging your bets in opening should look like saying less, not saying everything. And I don't think they narrowed that down well. But they did talk about what Sarah Boone will testify to. Sarah Boone, we know, is going to testify and has to testify. So much of the opening statement relied on what Sarah Boone will tell the jury. So really, I think the jury's going to be waiting to see the video evidence and waiting to hear Sarah Boone testify. And then we got into the civilian witnesses, and the 911 operator. The 911 call was authenticated. The receipts and store security video from Publix were authenticated. And then we got to Sarah Boone's neighbors. Both neighbors are young men that were living there while they were going to college. And they talk about the night that this happened. And both of them describe hearing a loud crashing and boom thump that shook the walls of their apartment. The second witness described the fact that the bedrooms in their one-story apartment back up to Sarah Boone and George Torres's townhouse-style apartment, and the staircase goes down behind where their bedrooms are. And so it sounded to the witness like something started making noise above his head in the apartment and then came down past his apartment to the bottom. Both witnesses described a similar thing where the noise was farther away and then got closer. It sounds very much as if something was, or someone was, coming down the staircase. And I am concerned that that was the victim in the suitcase. I don't know what more we will hear about that, or if it will be until closing arguments, but that's sure what that testimony sounded like. Both of the roommates who had lived next to Sarah Boone and George Torres, I thought were great witnesses. Very factual, very concise, very precise with, this is what I heard, that is not what I know, this is what I know. And both of them talked about the fact that there was lots of arguing constantly. And one of the roommates said in his testimony, when asked why he kind of stayed away from Sarah Boone and George Torres, yeah, exactly his testimony. Yeah, I don't like being around people who are drunk, and they were drunk a lot. And it was very clear that the level of intoxication and screaming back and forth was uncomfortable for both of these college students to live next to. And it was why they kind of noped out of interacting with Sarah and George Torres. So with all of that, I have one outstanding question. Why is the prosecution not asking the percipient witnesses to identify Sarah Boone in court? Because Sarah Boone is sitting in court and they keep referring to Sarah, and they have not said to anybody, hey, is that the Sarah that you're talking about sitting there? Or, hey, do you see the Sarah that you're talking about sitting in court? George Torres's brother briefly testified at the beginning of this case and never identified Sarah sitting there in court. The two roommates who lived next door to them never identified Sarah sitting there in court. They've never identified the defendant. It's wild to me to watch. And at one point, the prosecution refers to Sarah Boone as the defendant, and everybody agrees, and the defense doesn't object. But I'm waiting for the other shoe on that, because we've never talked about who Sarah Boone is in court. So we will see what happens, but they should be tying together that the person they're testifying about is the person they see in the courtroom. So we'll see what happens. At the end of day one of Florida versus Sarah Boone, the state got through 10 witnesses, including lots of their body cam evidence, the defendant's ex-husband, Brian Boone, and the crime scene investigator that recovered physical evidence from the crime scene, including the mega pints or magnums of wine and a baseball bat and the suitcase in this case, which seemed much smaller when it was brought into the courtroom than it was perceived to be on the video that people have seen from this case. And even in photos, it just seemed smaller when it was there in the courtroom. And so today we got through a lot of the foundational evidence and moved through incredibly quickly. Very few objections, maybe only one or two. Lots of evidence moved in, the crime scene photos, the physical evidence. I already said the body cam footage. So I imagine as we get into next week, we are going to see very early on the coroner and other evidence, and then we will get into the lead investigator and all of Sarah Boone's other interviews. But this case, I don't think is going to take nearly as long as the 3 weeks that the jury are qualified for. In opening statements, the defense did say they expected the jury would hear from Sarah Boone next week. So I think we will be through the state's case in just a handful more days because they are moving through quickly. And when you have a clear picture of where your case is going and what the evidence is, there's not much more to say. They need to bring in the cell phone videos from Sarah's cell phone, her digital evidence, which will be probably with their lead investigator or the technician that downloaded it, her interview, and that's really not too much more. It's just a very clearly presented case at this point at the end of day one, and it's refreshing to see. The crime scene investigator had like crime scene tape and like a whole chain of command. It was really nice to see everything running smoothly without any hyperbole or fuckery. 10 out of 10, everyone running this case, and I think some of that reflects on the judge as well. For deep dives into the stories that I covered here, you can find them on my YouTube channel at The Emily D. Baker and The Emily Show podcast. I stream every Tuesday and Thursday. The podcast goes live on Wednesdays. And if you want to stay in the loop with everything I'm doing, receive the fastest notifications out there, and get more Law Nerd community, join me at lawnerdapp.com, our free app for iOS and Android.